Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight coming to you from Beijing. Last week, foreign ministers of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, recognized space as an operational domain, giving it the same status as air, land, sea, and cyberspace. The yet-to-be-established Space Force outlined the agency's agenda, including the deployment of space warfighters. In August, the U.S. Space Command was launched, and U.S. Vice President Mike Pence said, quote, "America is leading in space once again," end of quote. With space becoming a war-fighting domain, could it lead to future military threats in space among major powers? Before we get down to a discussion also about this, take a look at the latest.
Is fending off a space invasion no longer science fiction? At a recent NATO summit, the alliance said they were adding space as the fifth domain of security concern on top of land, sea, air, and cyberspace.
NATO has no intention to put weapons in space. We are a defensive alliance, but making space an operational domain will help us ensure that all aspects are taken into account to ensure the success of our missions.
The NATO announcement is the latest sign of a rising defense space race. Earlier this year, India became the fourth country to display capacity in anti-satellite weapons, also known as ASAT, following the lead of the US, Russia, and China. There's also the trend toward creating a dedicated division for space in militaries, with the US and France already setting up space commands. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson pledges to create the UK's first space command if his party wins re-election in December. Everybody says they seek to avert a space war, but many point out taking the high ground is the best way to prevent one from breaking out.
So where is the U.S. Space Command headed to boldly go where no one has gone before? Let's turn to our panelists, both from the U.S., to help us understand better. In Washington, D.C., we have Dr. Brian Whedon, who's the Director of Program Planning for Secure World Foundation. Also in D.C., we are joined by Richard White, a security expert from Wikistrat Global Consultancy. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. The world is interested and also curious about specifically that organization. Mr. Whedon, how much can you tell us about the real nature of it, and how is it related to the other sides of the U.S. defense?
So Space Force is a reorganization of the way the U.S. military does training, recruiting, and procurement for space operations. A lot of that is currently being done by the U.S. Air Force, and there's a lot of dissatisfaction with how the U.S. Air Force is doing it. So the intent of the Space Force is to reorganize that into a separate entity that can focus on space and hopefully do a better job of it than the Air Force currently has been doing. The other entity that was recently created is U.S. Space Command.
That's right.
And the difference is that while the Space Force is focused on this training, recruiting, purchasing mission, the Space Command is focused on operations, what the military calls warfighting. So you can think of it as the Space Force would be in charge of buying and procuring new satellites and training the people to operate them, and then the Space Command is responsible for using those satellites in military operations.
Mr. White, of course, we earlier talked about this topic, but there are new developments in this regard. So what do you make of the latest development in terms of its significance in building stronger Space Command and also Space Force and the interactions between them?
Well, we've seen some progress in terms of both the areas that Brian discussed. We've seen the Space Command stand up, and we've seen Congress focus on pushing along the Space Force. And we've seen also concurrent developments. In particular, we've seen NATO, the topic of your previous session, discuss how to make space an operational domain. And these are all, I think, a recognition of the importance of space for communications, logistics, situation awareness, and so on. And then, of course, the debate everyone will be focusing on is how much should you spend, what should be your priority missions, how should the Space Command interact with other commands, how should NATO collectively buy some of these forces, or is it each going to be the case that each country will buy them and then pull them together? So there are a bunch of issues left unresolved, even despite the recent developments.
Mr. Weiss, you and I talk about that, but still, for many of our viewers who do not necessarily know all the details of this, they would compare this to the quote-unquote the strategy of Star Wars or scenarios of Star Wars decades ago. Now, Mr. Weiss, how would you describe these two very different concepts?
Sure. So the key issue is what you're seeing now is militaries using space to support operations on Earth or the sea, so that space support for terrestrial operations. There's not a great drive by any country to put weapons in space and then use these to attack other countries' space forces. Countries have these capabilities. We saw China test this capability a couple decades ago. India most recently. The U.S. and Russia, of course, have this capability during the Cold War. So they're all developing these options. But there's not an effort to really want to use those. Countries are still trying to negotiate how to prevent these kind of attacks, how to work out kinds of norms and rules of behavior. I suppose the most significant development has been the rise of these private space companies, first in the U.S. and I think now China as well. So we're going to see a lot more satellites and so on. But again, these are the issue we're trying to face is how to prevent collisions, how to prevent attacks on these forces. You know, Star Wars, when you see the movie, you think of this as putting massive spaceships like warships in the sea in space and using them to attack other warships. We're not anywhere near there.
Mr. Whedon, of course, as Mr. Weiss earlier illustrated, there should be a lot of discussion about the rules, and yet many would assume with the latest geopolitical development, whether the time is on our side to develop the rules, it's a big question mark.
You know, I think you're right on that. There have been, you know, debates for at least 20, 30 years now about how do we update the existing space law framework from the core treaties that were signed in the 1960s and 70s to something more robust that does a better job of dealing with the modern challenges. Everything from not only the risk of conflict we talked about, but things like space debris and collisions and all these new commercial. But as you point out, there's a lot of, there's a growing number of countries that are involved in space, which means there are more countries that are involved in the diplomatic discussion. And those countries have a wide range of capabilities, of competence, of interests. And getting all of them to agree on something and come to consensus is really challenging. At the moment, we see there's sort of two threads that are happening. You have, on the one hand, Russia and China pushing a draft treaty on what they call the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space that is focused on preventing weapons or such as space-based missile defense being put into orbit. On the other hand, you have the U.S. and its allies pushing what they call as transparency and confidence-building measures, kind of non-legally binding ways to reduce the risk of escalation. And those are two very different perspectives. And at the moment, neither one is really making a ton of progress.
On the other hand, there is also the issue of, Mr. Weiss, the arms race. Earlier, we talked about that too. But, you know, with different ideas about whether a framework could ever be established. So obviously, every individual party would rush to build up more capabilities in order to defend themselves to begin with. So arms race is a potential danger over there, Mr. Weiss.
Well, the countervailing tendencies at work, though, is that, as was mentioned, many countries now use space primarily for their commercial satellites. So you would not want to see these become more vulnerable through the development of capabilities that could be used to interfere with satellites, shoot them down. So all the countries, in principle, have an incentive to try and avert that. There's also a great expense. I mean, it costs a lot to put weapons in space, keep them there, and particularly if you use them, there's also a lot of unintended consequences. So if you blow up something in space, then it spreads debris all over the place, and that can interfere with other. So there are incentives. The problem we're facing now is that there are different definitions of what's a weapon in space. So Russia and China have a space treaty, various iterations of it. They've been pushing for international adoption, but it would seem to avoid covering some issues of concern to the Western powers and apply to others. And I think it's going to be difficult to negotiate these kind of treaties with so many parties, so many definitional issues. But the norms can perhaps be dealt with on a more technical basis.
Yeah.
And again, there's a strong incentive to, I think, mutual deterrence, if we're going to go back to the arms race analogy, could work very well here. That if a country would refrain from attacking or interfering with another country's satellite, if it's transparent enough that the party being attacked would be able to identify and respond in kind.
Now, Mr. Whedon, there are a lot of priorities, actually. I'm sure whether it comes to the budget or comes to the future planning, that one government such as that in Washington has to struggle with, just like many governments around the world. Now, develop the Space Force and Space Command is one thing. The Congress is working on that, but how much priority will it occupy on the agenda? And compared to particularly to some of the most important development in the digital world. So how do you see the struggling of priorities at this time for Washington?
No, it's a great question. It's a really good point. Space has always struggled to find itself to be the priority because the space world in the U.S., even though the U.S. spends the most on military and security space, it is still much smaller in terms of people and budget than the rest of the military. So that is actually part of the whole Space Force debate, is there's an emphasis to try and push the priority of space. So at the moment, you mentioned what Congress is talking about. The Space Force is wrapped up in the debates about the fiscal year 2020 National Defense Authorization Act. There's a lot of other issues in there. The two biggest contentious issues at the moment are Trump's demand to use Pentagon money to pay for his border wall, and then also the nuclear modernization. Those two things are tying up the process. And then you also have, I would say, Space Force as sort of the next most contentious issue. I think looking forward, we're probably going to see something like a Space Force, or maybe even called a Space Corps, that comes out of Congress. But the big question, as you hint at, is the money for it, is the budget. Right now, there's roughly about maybe $25 billion a year or so that is being spent on military space. Some people like to see that go up, but more broadly, the Congress is anticipating flat or barely increasing defense budgets for the next several years. And so any increases in space are going to have to fight for priority against increases for the Air Force, for the Navy, for the Army, all of whom want their own share of that money or to grow for the money. So I'm not certain that space is going to be able to win that fight because those other services have a lot more power within the political battles.
It is not rare news that we see military side officials have been resigning over the past few years since this administration. Meanwhile, some of the also president-appointed officials have also resigned, not just within military ranking. So how do you see all of these factors working together eventually regarding the future of Space Command or a Space Force in this regard?
Well, at the moment, the top leaders in the space world, people like General Raymond, who just took over U.S. Space Command.
Right.
General Hyten, who left U.S. Strategic Command, is now working for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They are, in general, very well respected. So we don't see those same level of consternation and resigning, or even really just controversies going on in the space world. It's sort of been able to stay away from that. But there is the broader question of just focus and time. There have been thousands and thousands of hours of staff time spent so far on this Space Force issue, just in doing all the planning and all the thinking about it. And even if Congress tomorrow says go ahead and create it, there's going to be thousands of more hours figuring everything from force structures and organizational charts to uniforms and rank structures. And so the question is just how much are those other issues and those other controversies and the resignings and the vacancies going to slow down all of the work that needs to go in to make this reality. I think people shouldn't underestimate just how much work needs to go into this. It's not a matter of Congress or the President just flipping a switch and all of a sudden it happens. There's a lot of work that needs to happen on the back end.
If it is a serious plan, of course. Mr. White's also about that we have seen, you know, President appointees over the past few years have been changing very frequently in some of the areas regarding military operations. If the President in your country is considering it as a signature action or signature plan he put out, now with the election season and with the end of the election season, we do not know the result yet, what would it mean for such a plan, which is huge budgeted, and which caused a very different direction of the development of the military, and certainly caused a overall new thinking about how to interact with other players around the world. So what does that mean, Mr. White? You've been through various administrations. I'm sure you understand this very sophisticatedly.
Yes. So I guess I would answer it at two levels. So there will be fluctuations depending on the political situation in the U.S. Now, the Space Command, Space Force is not a major campaign issue. So they will not influence the election. But President Trump, as you said, has made this a top priority for his administration. The Democratic candidates, depending on who faces them, I haven't seen one of them that's championed this issue. So it's possible that depending on who's elected, they may de-emphasize this issue, may want to reduce funding, may want their own kind of structure. So that would be the one. That would be a varying factor. But there's also a strong constant factor. We've seen space becoming increasingly important for many countries. That's not going to change. The U.S. is going to need space to support military operations on the ground. That's not going to change. So there are these drivers that are going to cause the U.S. military and therefore the White House and Congress have to spend a lot of time thinking about what kind of space capabilities the U.S. needs, how it's going to work with allies and partners, and then how it's going to try and work with other countries, and so on. So you'll have some variation against a larger constancy, and I think that's often true with U.S. foreign policy decisions in general. Large variations. Thank you so much, Richard White and Brian Whedon. Thank you for helping us to understand better about this very interesting development. Appreciate it. Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, into our search engine. Check out our Facebook and Twitter accounts as well. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for watching and tune in next time for more insights across China and